Okay, now we're going to recap a little bit about aperture. As we said before, aperture is the size of the hole in your lens that lets in the light to reach a camera sensor. And the bigger the aperture is, the smaller the f number is, and the smaller the f number is, the bigger the aperture is. Now, as we said before, it's a lot easier to think about f-stops as the amount your hole is actually covered by. So for example, f36, your hole is covered by a lot, and that lets in little amount of light, so you have a small aperture. So in terms of aperture, the bigger the aperture, the bigger the amount of light, the more brighter your picture is. And the smaller the aperture, the smaller the amount of light, so the darker your picture is going to be. So let's just demonstrate it a little bit here. Now I've got basically a table full of household items. So you can also, at your home or wherever you may be, pick up everyday items and do a little test, and let's get used to your aperture a little bit. So we have some coffee, we have some sweetness, and we have a Thomas the Tank Engine toy. So any mothers, anyone with kids around will definitely find some toys to play about in this example. And we have some Along Come Betty hands that do wishes cream. So we have some hand lotion that is moisturizing and beautifully fragrance. So this proves that anything will really do for this exercise. So you can put your camera on either aperture priority, or you can put your camera on manual for this. So aperture priority, again, you just have to focus on the aperture. Your camera will focus on the shutter speed for you. But in this instance, because we know nothing is moving here, we can put the shutter speed on 1/60, so a 60th of a second if we're putting it on manual. So let's just put it on manual, and then let's put the shutter speed on a 60th of a second, so 1/60. And the ISO, let's just put it as, say, 400, because this area is not the brightest, but it's not dark as well. It's an average lit room, so let's put it on 400. Now, with the aperture, what we're going to do first is we're going to put your f number on, say, f3.5. So, and then we're going to just test it out, how much light this gets in your picture. Now, if your camera doesn't go right down to f3.5, you might see that it only gets to f5.6. All you have to do, you have to just zoom out. So when you're taking a picture, you'll hear the camera just beeping, and that beep just tells you you're in focus, and that's if you have your focus on autofocus AF. If you have your camera on manual focus, you have to do the focusing by yourself. But for this instance, we're just going to put it on autofocus. So we don't have to worry about the focus at the moment, as we're just really getting used to the manual mode. So, you hear that beep? Okay. Now you can see by this picture, it has quite a good level of exposure. So let's experiment what exactly happens when we increase our f number now, and we increase it right to the other side to f30, let's go f22. Okay, now we see on this picture is an entirely different story. We see a really dark picture, is underexposed. And why is that? That's because we increased our f-stop, so we decreased our aperture, we decreased the size of our hole. So not a lot of light is getting let through to the camera sensor. So that's why it's really dark. So now we know a big aperture lets in a lot of light. A small aperture lets in a small amount of light. Now, a big aperture, lots of light, but it's a small f number, small f stop. And a small aperture lets in little amount of light, but then it's a big f number, it's a big f stop. So now what I want to do, I just want to experiment a little bit about the depth of field. And as we said, the depth of field, the smaller the f number, the smaller the depth of field. The bigger the f number, the bigger the depth of field. And again, what is depth of field? Depth of field is how much of your shot in focus. So small depth of field, small f number, it's only going to be focused on one, maybe two things. But then a big depth of field is going to be focused on everything here. And then let's experiment. So first we're going to put your f number back on 3.5 and then we'll see what happens there. Okay, we see here the alarm comes. Betty is really in focus, but then the sweetener at the back, the coffee at the back is really out of focus. And if you want it to focus less or focus more, all you have to do is move closer or further away from your subject. Okay, now we're going to do the other way. So now we want a big depth of field. We want every single thing on this table in focus. And how do we achieve this? We achieve this by increasing your f number again. So bigger f number, big depth of field, smaller f number, small depth of field. So now, if your camera on aperture priority, you wouldn't have to worry about the shutter speed. But then if your camera is on manual, we'll have to just balance the shutter speed once we move the aperture to get that balanced exposure. As we talked about just now, a bigger f number has little amount of light. So let's increase our f number first. Now, because it's just a few items on this table, even a f number of f16, even maybe f14 will still manage to get this in focus because it's not a big landscape we're talking about, they're quite close together. If you look in your camera, press the shutter, you'll hit that beep, 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 beep that says it's in focus. Also, what will happen at the same time, your line of exposure will set telling you roughly how much underexposed or exposed your picture is going to be. And this time it's saying I'm very much underexposed. So this means my picture is very dark, as I said earlier, because we increased the f number. We covered our hole a lot, and this didn't let any light through the lens to the camera sensor. So to balance the exposure back up, what we can do, we can either slow down our shutter speed, but at this point it's on 1/60, 1/60th of a second, and we don't have a tripod, so I don't really want to put it more slower than a 60th of a second because then you'll see the motion blur. So the only choice we really have is to adjust your ISO. So let's adjust our ISO. At the moment it was on 400. Let's just test and see how it behaves if we put it on 800. Now let's half click again. Okay, it's still saying it needs more light, it's underexposed. So we're going to go again and let's try 1600. And then we'll try again. And it's still quite underexposed. So we have no choice at the moment. We have to whack our ISO even further up. So, you know what, let's go all the way to 6400. Now you can see from this picture, even though it has a good level of exposure, you can now begin to see the grain come into the picture because of the high ISO.